Hi, my name is Professor Kate Watkins and I'm the psychology tutor at St Anne's College here at the University of Oxford.
Hi, and I'm Nick Yeung, and I'm a tutor and I do interviews at University College for psychology and PPL. So we're going to talk a bit about interviews and how we use them. So perhaps, Kate, do you want to start by talking a bit about what you are looking for when you do your interviews?
Yeah, I guess that the most important thing is some sort of enthusiasm for the course, good motivation for wanting to study psychology, either experimental psychology or in combination with linguistics or philosophy, and some, I guess, like spark really, like that is a bit difficult to identify as a single thing. But I guess you see that when somebody is genuinely enthused by the study of psychology, which of course can be like really broad and be applicable in so many different contexts. So often, a student may talk about like their experience, and it's interesting to explore how they've thought about psychology in the context of that experience, like even working in a supermarket, why people make choices about brands and things. Probably it's good if the student is kind of able to articulate quite clearly what they're thinking and is able to demonstrate in the interview that clarity of thought and how well they respond to information we give them, how good a listener they are, and then how well they adapt when we give them new information and take that on board and revise their thinking. That sort of thing. There's probably a few more things I've forgotten. What about you? Do you have more?
Yeah, similar. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that sort of enthusiasm and that interest in just thinking like a psychologist about whatever topic it is. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you think students come with any sort of preconceptions about what they needed to have studied before they got here, or?
Well, I think psychology is an interesting subject, right? Because about half of our applicants come with some psychology that they've been taught in schools, and half haven't, and so we get people with very different sort of interests or sort of different experiences of psychology already.
Yeah.
And so part of what we do in the interviews, I guess, sort of starting to think about what questions we ask is trying to kind of level the playing field a bit. So typically in an interview, I won't ask them much or anything really about psychology they've studied in the past, although I know some tutors and interviewers will. I tend to give them a problem to think about, where all the information they need to solve that problem, which might be thinking about an experiment, which is what we'll do in the practice interview in a bit, is there in the question, and it's really how they think about that information and think through it logically. So all the things that you were thinking about. So how do they think kind of clearly and logically about the experimental design? How do they use the information we give them? If we give them extra information, how do they then kind of use that to update their thinking? Sometimes, do they change their mind or stick with what they're thinking? So yeah.
I mean, it's going to be interesting because we've never actually interviewed together, and we probably have slightly different ways of interviewing, as do our very many colleagues in the university. So I think it's fair to say that, on some occasions, people will give you something to read in advance of the interview and then ask you questions about it. Sometimes during the interview, they'll show you some data, maybe on a graph, and they'll ask you to describe it, that sort of thing. And all of those things can be really useful. And even over Teams in this kind of format, we're still able to do that kind of interview questions, but we're probably not going to demonstrate that today, I think.
Yeah, and I think that sort of relates to a theme of how I do interviews and what questions we ask, is that typically we'll be talking about some psychology experiments, because that's what we do in our degree here. And I think often sort of describe interviews as being a bit like a mini tutorial. And so just as what you do in a tutorial varies a lot, so the tutorial that's really important to our teaching system of the tutors talking with small groups of students, we might be discussing a specific experiment, or we might be thinking about a general problem. And so what you do in an interview is just as varied as well, but they're all kind of centered around that same thing of an academic discussion about the subject and really thinking through deeply about a topic. And so even if the basic format, whether you've read a lot about it in advance or you've done some pre-interview reading, or there's some information given to you at the time, and let's think through that. or even sometimes we ask something that's not really psychology, but it's a more general reasoning puzzle, and just get people to see how they think clearly and logically through a problem.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's good to point out the similarity between an interview and a tutorial, and obviously that's an important part of the way that we teach here. But I think it's probably fair to say that as part of the admissions process, we don't weight the interview solely, right? We take into account a lot of other factors, and you know, sometimes that that'll include things like performance on that admissions test, the TSA, because that's typically the only thing that we have that every student we see will have done. You know, the UCAS form, their previous academic performance, if we have information about that. And so, yeah, it's all, the interview helps to kind of flesh out that picture that we've got from the data we already have, but it's not everything. And it's certainly my impression that sometimes the student gets the feeling that the interview hasn't gone that well, but that's probably what is a typical experience of all of our students. And if it does feel like that, it probably doesn't, you shouldn't worry too much.
Yeah. Well, that goes back to that thing that we were talking about, it being like a tutorial. Like, what we want to see is students really thinking through something they haven't got the answer to already, because that's what you do. That's what university's for, is like learning how to do that. And so in an interview, I want to get to a point in a question where they haven't thought about that before, and they don't necessarily know how to think about it, and to see what they do when they are uncertain and how they go about kind of answering a difficult question. So yeah, and yeah, I completely agree about that. That the interview is just one. It's useful because it's something we get from everybody that we're considering, and similarly for the pre-interview test. Whereas people are coming from all over the world, you know, and they have very different school backgrounds and school grades, some of which I think, you know, have to look up to interpret, and so that having that common ground is really useful. But it is only one piece. I always talk about it with psychology students, saying, you know, you'd be sort of crazy if you've got this measure that's half an hour of a discussion, and weighing that much more heavily than the result of 13 years of study at school. And I think that's a good way to sort of how I think about how we use interviews as a useful piece of information, but obviously not the most important or the most reliable if you think as a psychologist about it.
Exactly. I was just going to say, as psychologists, we know how unreliable interviews can be. So, yeah. Okay, so I think we'll move on to the interview. Hi, my name is Kate Watkins. I'm a psychology tutor at St Anne's College.
Hi, and I'm Nick Yeung. I'm a tutor at University College. Nice to meet you.
And do you want us to call you Bethan or Beth?
I'm quite happy with Beth.
Okay, so obviously we're doing this interview in Teams. If there are any connection problems or anything, or if you can't hear us or we can't hear you, then we'll just, you know, feel free to repeat yourself or ask us to repeat ourselves. So, okay, great. So I just wanted to ask you something about your personal statement. So I was having a look at that before this interview, and I noticed that you'd done an EPQ on parental bonds and early infancy. Can you tell us a little bit about the EPQ and why you did it?
Yeah, I was really interested in developmental psychology, and I had some younger siblings, and I noticed that they were a lot closer to my mum than they were to their father figure, and I wondered why that was. So I decided to look at lots of different factors: psychological, biological, and sociological. So I looked at things like parental leave from work, breastfeeding, loads of different other things. What else did I look at? Bonding, the changes in the brain when the baby is born. I think the mother's amygdala heightens in activity, which makes them more alert to babies crying in the night, whereas that doesn't happen for fathers. And I just found it really interesting as to all the different factors that kind of play into that bonding situation.
Oh, so was there a kind of conclusion to the study? Like what did you find out that perhaps you didn't know before?
I think I didn't realise how many biological changes there were and how like prominent they are, and maybe that is the explanation. And I thought that was quite the dominant explanation, but also the fact that there is a lot of environmental factors involved, and the world is kind of set up for mothers to parent their children. So in a way, there's kind of that interaction. But for me, I did think the biological findings were like quite overwhelming.
Okay, interesting. Great. So we're going to ask you a couple of questions that we prepared and that we're asking all of the candidates today. I'm going to hand over to Nick for the first one.
Okay, great. So I'm asking you a question about face processing in the brain. So I'll describe a scenario, and then we'll think through some questions. Okay. So the scenario is that the ability to recognize and identify faces is a very important skill that we mostly take for granted in our everyday lives, but a small number of people find it very difficult to recognize faces, even those of people that they know very well. And the occurrence of this thing, sometimes called face blindness, might be taken to indicate that there's a specific brain system that's responsible for recognizing and identifying faces, and this system presumably doesn't function properly for people suffering from face blindness. So imagine there's a professor called Professor Smith who's interested in testing this idea that there's a specific face recognition system in the brain. And so she conducts an experiment in which she measures brain activity as people look at pictures of faces, and she finds that indeed there's a region of the brain that is particularly activated when people view faces, and she concludes that she's discovered the brain's face area. Okay? So that's the kind of experimental scenario I'd like to think about now. So let me know if you have any questions about that before we get started. But otherwise, the first question I'd like us to think about is whether there are any details of Professor Smith's experiment that you would want to know before you could trust the results that I just described.
Would you want to maybe look at a control group to see if the participants, you need a comparative basically to see if what the difference in activity in the brain from the people with the problems with facial processing and normal people, to see if the activity levels are different.
Mm-hmm. So imagine for this experiment, it's not done in those face blind people. We might come back to the people with face blindness in a bit. So this would be neurologically kind of typically developing who can recognize faces, and when they're looking at faces, we see this brain area active. Yeah, so that's an important clarification. Yeah, so we might come back later to the face blind participant patients, but yeah. So if you imagine what we've done is Professor Smith has put these people in a brain scanner, shown them pictures of faces. We find this area that's particularly activated. Yep. So how about that? If we think about that experiment, what would you need to know before you could trust those results?
You would need to know whether they've controlled things like what the participants had experienced, the duration they've been shown the face, how many faces they've been shown, the time period between the pictures being shown. It needs to be consistent for all participants so that then you can trust the validity of those results.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So tell me about that. So you mentioned that it's important to know how many faces are shown. What's your thinking there?
Because if you show maybe a lot of faces, it could overwhelm someone, and then they might begin to not recognize them. If you showed, say, maybe a series of blonde people, you'd be a bit more confused and not be able to recognize faces as clearly, whereas you don't want to show too many to overwhelm, and you also want to show a variety so that the facial processing can occur.
Okay, so you mean sort of recognize in the sense of distinguish between the different faces as well. So if they're all too similar, you start to just see they all sort of start to blend into one almost. Right. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I guess how might that impact if you think about the results as described, where what Professor Smith is seeing is there is a particular area of the brain that's active, or there's an area of the brain that's particularly active when people look at faces, in terms of that idea of people being overwhelmed or seeing too many faces?
Then maybe if they were overwhelmed, it would cause weaker facial processing. So there might be lower activity in the brain, the area of the brain that recognizes faces, than if you'd shown. So if you show someone 10 photos, their activity might be lower, whereas if you show someone 5, theirs might be higher.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So in terms of thinking about the experiment, is there anything you want to know more? You want to know about the activity itself or the area of the brain that's activated?
You would want to know its location, maybe whether it's linked to any other areas. So if there's kind of like a connection between the two, because then maybe if one isn't functioning, the other one wouldn't function, and you have to pinpoint in certain people whether that's different.
Yeah. So let's say we found this area that's kind of consistent across individuals, but where would, I guess, when you're saying its location, what would be a marker that you could trust the results versus not?
What did you say? Sorry, the mark.
Or what were you thinking about when you said that you want to know the location? So how would that help you know you could trust the results? So there are locations that you think, yeah, that makes sense, versus locations that don't.
So you would think about which lobe in the brain, maybe the potential areas, and then if there's prior research that suggests that area of the brain was linked to facial processing, you could say, okay, well that makes sense. Whereas if it was in, I don't know, the area of the brain that processes language, it would be a little bit more strange.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or the amygdala, for example, would be interesting that you mentioned earlier. Yeah. Great. Okay, so let's think. So that's some important details that you might want to know before you trusted the results. But let's say that you were sort of reassured on all those points, that it was a carefully done experiment and that it was in a region that sort of made sense. Can you think of ways to improve the design of that experiment?
So you would maybe do a few trials to exclude some anomalies. You would control variables such as maybe not let the participants have any caffeine because that can stimulate them, or think about what medications they're on. You would maybe do different faces, so you would maybe have like a array of the same race or a mix of genders, and maybe do different trials on each ones. Trying to think more.
Do you think there are other kinds of stimuli you might want to use as well?
What did you say? Sorry, I missed it.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah. Do you think there are other kinds of stimuli you might want to include as well? So you talked about different kinds of faces.
You could maybe look at, this is a bit of a random one, I just thought of animals, and maybe see if people can recognise different animal faces, and then see, is the deficit in their brain function specifically linked to humans, or is it other things, maybe different flowers, and just to isolate the fact that that is faces and not something else.
We'll come back to those face-blind patients again in a bit, but let's think. So what we're doing at the moment is these kind of experiment with, let's say, kind of, I don't know what the right word is, but kind of healthy people who can recognise faces. So you thought about animals and flowers, and I think that's really interesting. So what's your thought about why those might be good control stimuli?
I suppose animals, because they're similar to humans, but they don't have as many differences, maybe. I don't know. And maybe you do different breeds of dog, or I'm not sure. But they're kind of live stimuli, whereas if you show someone photos of the sky, that's not as comparative to humans as animals are.
Mm-hmm.
Flowers is a rogue one in comparison. But for animals,
so why might flowers? Because I think flowers might be really good. So can you think why I might be thinking that? That's a quite sensible question.
Maybe because there's a wide variety of flowers. There's a wide variety of humans. Whereas, again, going back to the sky is either blue, dark, cloudy. It's not as a broad spectrum. Whereas with flowers, you can have a million different types of roses. And then that, again, reflects the variety you get in the human race.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. So, I mean, if you're kind of so part of it is the variety. Yeah. Okay. And so you could have a variety of different stimuli, and so you can show it's not just that you're showing the same thing again and again. Like you said, if it's the sky, maybe people just get bored, and brain activity, as you were saying earlier, with faces kind of goes down as people get bored. And yeah, great. Okay. So, can you sort of outline then? So, what might the experiment look like? So, we're showing pictures of faces. and let's say animals and flowers.
Yeah. So you would, if you're measuring brain activity, you'd need someone in a brain scanner. So maybe a PET scan and probably fMRI for brain activity and structure. Someone would be laid down and you'd have a screen above them. You'd flash up an image potentially of a person, leave it for an interval of like 3 seconds, give them a break of 5 seconds to just look at a blank screen, then maybe show a flower for 3 seconds, blank screen for 5, then an animal. And to measure, you'd look at the brain activity. And then I'm trying to think if the participant would need to do anything else. I don't know, maybe show them again, like on 3 times or maybe so, and then measure the level of brain activity for each individual picture to see if it goes up each time they recognise the face. But you'd have to do a random order. So you'd show it in an order of the first trial, randomise the order of the pictures for the next trial, and then see if and then you'd have to like do some very complex analysis and match all the trials with the pictures and things like that.
Okay. So suppose what you found, because I think this idea of recognition, you're sort of talking about recognizing in terms of being familiar with that particular face. That's an interesting one. So, I mean, let's say so I guess what you're thinking there is brain activity that maybe is increasing with every time you see that same face. But what would you expect? I guess if it is a face area, just to be clear, what would you expect to see in kind of when they see the same animal or the same flower again and again?
I think maybe it wouldn't be as high. I'm not sure. Because with an animal, there isn't as many distinctions. And maybe with humans, you feel more emotion. And it's that when you're doing facial processing, you're looking at someone's face and their emotions and you're taking that in. Whereas with an animal, it feels a bit more distant. And you would maybe expect less activity because of that, especially with a flower, there's not much emotional connection to that. Whereas when you see a human, there's like, your brain recognizes that and goes, I recognize that human, and you give them a bit of a backstory in your mind and things like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, that started to hint at something that's important here about kind of thinking about what the brain activity is doing, right? So there's one aspect, which is sort of that recognition and sort of linking it with memory, but then there's an interesting thing that you were saying that faces might have more emotional links as well. And so that starts to get at sort of the difficulty of interpreting what that brain activity means. So I wish we had time to kind of explore that in a bit more detail, but we don't. So I'm going to ask one last question, which is thinking back to those face blind people. Supposing now you do this experiment, so we've got a nice experiment designed, and let's say we find what you expected if it was a face area, that let's say it's more active when people look at faces and maybe even increases in activities you see the same face over and over again, but doesn't show that for animals or flowers. Supposing now you do that experiment we bring those the kind of healthy controls, so who can recognize faces, but also face blind people.
Yeah.
And we do that experiment. So we think we've got a face area, and we do that experiment. But what we find, actually, to our surprise, or to Professor Smith's surprise, what she finds is that this area is also activated in these face blind people. How might we explain that result? So these are people so we think we found a face area, but it's active in people who can't apparently recognize faces.
So that would maybe explain if it's activated in them, they might just have lower activity even if it's been activated, or it could explain that there's another area of the brain that needs looking at a bit more closely that might be impacting on their ability to recognize faces. Okay,
so tell me, what's your intuition, or what might be an intuition about what that other brain area might be doing?
The other brain area that's stopping them processing faces? Yeah. It could be stopping them. So they might recognize the face, but then they might not be able to process it and give them that emotion, attach those emotions to them, attach the backstory. So it's not as poignant for them and they can't recognize it again. So whereas the other people can, and then that means they've got poor memory of that face, and that's why it might be quite complex with the other brain regions.
Great. Okay. So I always just ask questions till I run out of time, and I think maybe I've done more than run out of time. So I'll hand you over to Kate for another question. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Nick. My question is kind of probing a little bit of a similar idea about experimental design, but I'm going to kind of give you free for all on this and ask you to design it from scratch. So the question is about the relationship between sleep and memory. So we've known for a long time that, you know, it's kind of common sense that sleep is really important for cognitive performance in general. But there's some indication that it's particularly critical for memory. So how would you design an experiment that would test whether sleep has an effect on the performance on a memory test? So tell me how you would test some participants, what your stimuli would be, what you'll measure, etc.
Okay.
You can take minutes to think about it if you want to think.
Okay, a minute. So you would need a memory test. So an easy one is kind of just like word list, 10 words, high frequency words, so people know what they are, quite easy to remember. You would maybe test people in the evening when they'd had been awake for say 8 hours. Then you would maybe let them sleep again for a controlled amount of time, so 8 hours, and then test them as soon as they woke up. And then you could also, if you wanted to get more measurements, test at intervals throughout the day when they're progressively getting more tired. And then you would need to control variables such as like their caffeine intake and things like that. Or you could do it where you had like a matched pairs design of a control group who had slept and a group that hadn't slept, and test their differences in remembering the word list. You would give them 30 seconds to say, like, write down all the words they could remember from the list.
Okay. So tell me what the test is every time you're testing them. You've given them 10 words and told them that they're going to have to remember those words, yeah? And then when you test them, what's the question?
So you would say, can you write down as many words that you can remember in 30 seconds, maybe? And they just write down all the words they could.
Okay. So being able to recall the words from the original list. Okay. So in this group where you've tested them when they wake up in the morning, what other factors aside from sleep do you think might affect performance then?
Their stress levels, perhaps. So if they're really stressed, they wouldn't have as good memory. If they're distracted, so they'd need to be in like a quiet room. If they've had interference throughout the day as well, so I think stress kind of comes into that. The caffeine intake, whether they were on any medication that does the opposite effect of caffeine.
Okay, let's assume they're all, you know, really happy students at the University of Oxford and they don't have any stress. So what are you comparing this recall that they did at 8 o'clock in the morning to? How will you know whether that's a good or a bad performance?
So you would have to compare it to either their recall when they were really tired before they went to bed, or you'd have to compare it to another group that hadn't slept. And then you'd obviously have to have quite a lot of people take a mean so that you knew what was good and it maybe potentially high on the normal distribution curve and what was not very good, which would hopefully, if your experiment worked, be the sleep deprived people.
Okay, so if we take that example, then the comparison between the two groups, the ones that have had a night's sleep and the ones that haven't, have been kept awake, can you conclude that sleep is the only explanation for the difference in their performance?
I don't think so, because it's a correlation, so you can't get cause and effect. There might be like another factor which is hard to isolate, like you can't isolate it potentially. So you would assume that the reason why their memory is poor is because of sleep, but there might be like other things like their stress levels, like they might have a brain deficit, which obviously you would try and eliminate that beforehand.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, how would you feel after a night's deprivation of sleep? Do you think it's just your memory that's affected?
No, I think your emotions would be affected. You'd feel very like anxious potentially. I know I'm a bit like grumpy the next day if I hadn't had much sleep. Your concentration in general, so it might not be that their memory suffered, but they might not just be able to concentrate enough to even like write words out.
And in some ways, all we are learning from this is, that tiredness perhaps makes it worse. So how might we kind of look at perhaps the other side of the coin, like the beneficial effects of sleep on memory?
So you would maybe just like if you want to look at it from an everyday perspective, look at things like school results. So you would maybe just like question.
Let me interrupt you. Sorry, I mean this in an experiment. Like, could you measure something about the sleep, perhaps?
So you want to look at quality of sleep? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Quality of sleep, length of sleep. So you'd look at people that slept 4 hours a night, 5 hours a night, 6 hours a night, 7 hours a night. Whether that sleep is interrupted, so someone with a newborn baby is going to be woken up and that's not complete sleep. And just in general, I think if you're stressed, you don't sleep that well. So things like that.
So quality of sleep is clearly important. Okay, I mean, there are lots of other things we could think about, like measuring things at different times of day and things like that. But I'd just quite like to know whether you think 10 words would be enough to measure performance on this test. Do you think people would do badly, or how could they show improvement on?
Probably not, because 10 words might be quite easy to remember, because short-term memory has like the capacity similar to that. So you'd maybe need to use more, and then you could see a greater difference between those that have slept and those that haven't slept. In terms of showing improvement, again, 10 doesn't give much leeway for that. If you've scored 9 on the first attempt, you can only improve by 1 sort of thing.
So you might need a more challenging test. But okay, just last thing then, how many participants would you have in your study and why?
So you would need quite a large number to not exclude anomalies. So I don't know, maybe like 50 to 100, but because you can't have a big enough number because of a huge number, sorry, because of like practical issues, just like things like you've probably got to pay them. Not many people might be here to be sleep deprived. It's marginally unethical. So you just, for practical reasons, you can't have thousands of people, so maybe between like 50 to 100.
Do you know any ways we could determine quantitatively, like with statistics, how many we'd need?
I think you'd maybe need to look at one of the stats tests to like determine significance, maybe, and look at how many participants looks like a nice number. I'm not really sure.
No, I don't worry. I'm not expecting to do. I'm just curious as to what you might think. Okay, great. I think I'll wind up there. And any other things from you, Nick, or should we?
Nope, no more questions from me. Thanks.
Yeah. So sometimes we'd ask you if you had any questions, if there was time at the end. Do you have any questions for us?
No, I don't think so. I think I'm all right. Thank you.
Great. No worries. Thanks very much, Beth. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
I guess I'd ask the first question, so I'll say a bit about that. So I thought it went well. I enjoyed the interview, and I think there was it was a good representation of how interviews are. So I think there were some of the things where, for example, I'm working through a set of preset questions so that I can evaluate everybody on the same kind of questions. And I think there was a bit where Beth got slightly off on the wrong foot in terms of thinking that the brain imaging experiment was about face blind participants, which, you know, it's easy to miss because I was going through the description quite quickly. You know, it might be different with a bit of time for pre-interview reading. And so I had to kind of bring her back a couple of times. So that's kind of fairly common, I think. So there were some missteps, and that's very characteristic of interviews, as we were sort of talking about before. I think a couple of things I really liked about what Bethan did was she had some good intuitions, and she was willing to sort of stop and think about them. So when we started talking about control stimuli, when I suggested that, she immediately sort of came up with some suggestions, and not just kind of, I think there were good intuitions there because she kind of suggested it, but then things that would actually be quite good. But when I asked her why would those be quite good, she had some good ways of sort of thinking about why you might pick those, and why, you know, you might actually have a range of different control stimuli and they might be good for different reasons. So I think there was that interaction where she was willing to sort of really listen to the question and stop and think was good. And so I think we got both sides in terms of some, you know, the missteps that are characteristic of interviews, and things don't always go smoothly, and I don't always get to work through my questions. But in terms of the things that went well and I'd highlight, I think that very kind of open discussion and her willingness to think about and come up with and unpack her thinking was really good. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think she ticks that box of clear enthusiasm for the course. You know, demonstrated that a little bit when she talked about her EPQ, and it came through in her questions. And, you know, obviously, I think she has that background in psychology, but it's not always necessary. I don't think it's always like that advantageous to have done that, because you can still work through these sorts of things. And what she demonstrated in terms of general skills was, I think she was really good at that interactive thing, and self-monitoring herself, like updating things. You know, when I asked her about how many stimuli she needed to have in her test, she kind of quite quickly realized that 10 perhaps wasn't going to be enough. So she was willing to change, you know, and not stick to like her first thoughts, which is great. And, you know, my last question about the effectively was about kind of the power of the experiment. How many people would you need to test? I just quite like to hear what students think at that point. But I think don't expect them to know about power or how to calculate how many people you need in an experiment, but just know that, you know, this is what we think of when we're designing experiments. They are scientific, and we do use statistics. So understanding the kind of the more quantitative side of the course, and that is required. I think she clearly kind of knew about that. So yeah, no, she did well, and I think it was a typical kind of interview performance, with, you know, areas of kind of going down alleys which were not fruitful, but coming back from them in response to like things that we gave her. So yeah, pretty good.
Yeah. So I guess we asked two psychology questions in that interview. Sorry, and yeah, often actually what I would do in an interview is ask one question like that's very psychology focused and is really about an experiment, and often a more general reasoning puzzle. And part of the reason we do that is that we interview for experimental psychology and PPL, so psychology, philosophy, and linguistics, with the same interview. We usually have an extra interview for linguistics, but everybody applying for EP and PPL at University College will get the same kind of basic interview set up with those two questions. How do you do the same at St Anne's?
Yeah, so yeah, we for the online interviews, we give the EP students this very similar psychology interview. As you say, perhaps not always two questions about experimental design, but we're testing different aspects of psychology. And then the linguistic students will have another people applying for psychology and linguistics will have another interview with a linguistics tutor, which will focus obviously on language. There's also a linguistics test that they do pre-interview, and then if they're coming for philosophy and psychology, then they will have an interview with our philosophers as well. And yeah, there'll be, again, no kind of prior knowledge needed for either of those interviews. It's unusual that you would have studied those at school. So yeah, everything's given to you in the interview to think about and demonstrate how you rationalize that information, or how you think about that new information. So very similar sorts of skills being tested in all of these interviews, but with slightly different kind of focuses or foci, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the topics will differ a lot, but across the interviews in a range of subjects. Hopefully, what we've done today is a good representation of the sort of interview you can expect, if not in content, but in the general sort of feel and format.